This video is going to be about the physical and motor development of infants. Infants, remember, are from birth to about 18 months of age. Physically, babies are growing a huge amount. This graph shows the rate of size change, and you can see that weight in the first few months increases dramatically and really continues to grow quite a lot. So babies really just grow a lot. Interestingly, a baby's head accounts for a disproportionately large percent of their body, and as they grow through the early years of life, they see a lot more length in their body so that their head starts to look a little bit more proportional. So here you can see that a newborn's head is approximately a quarter of their body, whereas by the time we're adults, it's more like an eighth. Sleep is a serious issue, of course, and babies need a ton of sleep. Newborns, about 16.5 hours a day. At about a month, we're talking a little bit less, about 15 hours a day. And the reason that babies need a lot of sleep actually has to do with brain development. So I'll mention this again in a moment when we talk about the brain. But of course it's a challenge for parents because babies don't sleep for 16 hours straight. They sleep for 2-hour increments and then want to eat, 2-hour increments and then want to eat. So it disturbs the 8 hours of sleep solid that an adult needs. One issue that a lot of people deal with is where to have the baby sleep. One option is in a crib, and this is a pretty common one in the United States. So this could either be in a crib with the parents in the bedroom or in a different room. Other people, though, want to have the baby closer to them, and they do what's called co-sleeping. So co-sleeping is where an infant sleeps in the bed with the parents. There's some really interesting research going on about co-sleeping to find out if it's good for things like attachment, because you could maybe make the argument that babies feel more safe and secure when they have that protection and that contact with a caregiver. But there are risks with co-sleeping. So for example, every year a disturbing number of babies die because their parents accidentally roll over on them in the night and either suffocate them or overheat them. Because remember, babies can't move, so if a blanket was to get pushed in front of its mouth, it couldn't use its hand to move that blanket, so the possibility of suffocating becomes higher. When we think about the baby's senses, it's really interesting to compare them because some are very developed at birth and some aren't. One that's good at birth is hearing, and in particular they like hearing certain things. Human voices is their favorite thing to listen to. And oftentimes parents will do something called motherese, and if the father's doing it, it's called fatherese. This is that baby talk, the, "Oh, sweet baby." Basically what happens with motherese is that we slow our language down into simpler words, and then we emphasize syllables. And from a language perspective, this is the beginning of a baby starting to understand the structure of language. We're breaking it down into the easiest, most basic pieces so that they can start to grasp things like the sounds that are coming out of my parents' mouth are actually broken into chunks that are words, and that we use those words to form sentences. Another interesting thing about infants is that they are what are referred to as universal listeners. So they come into the world prepared to speak any language because, of course, they don't know whether they'll be English speakers or Mandarin speakers or Cantonese speakers. So babies have the ability to hear all of the possible phonemes that the human vocal apparatus can make. A phoneme is a basic noise like th for th or ba for ba, and languages are made up on these phonemes. But every language uses a different subset, so there are a few hundred phonemes that our vocal apparatus as a species can make. But each language only uses a handful of these. So in English, for example, we have far fewer than a few hundred. And they're different than in some other languages. So as an example, if anybody either speaks Spanish or has learned to speak Spanish, you know that you're supposed to roll your R's sometimes. That rolling of the R is actually a different phoneme than the R that's used in English. But interestingly, as our brains develop, we lose this ability to be universal listeners, and we start to get specialized at the phonemes we hear in the language we're born into, and we lose the ability to hear the phonemes of other languages. So there's some cool studies where by the age of 6 months, babies can no longer hear things, the differences between sounds, for example, between two different languages that they could have heard at birth. Seeing is a totally different story. Babies actually have really terrible eyesight. It's their least mature sense. Additionally, they're very nearsighted and have binocular vision only after about 14 weeks, meaning that their eyes move together. So sometimes you might see babies who seem a little bit lazy-eyed, not necessarily going to be the case their whole life. Like with the sounds, babies also prefer human faces. They would rather look at a human face than anything else. And that happens directly from birth. It's almost like a reflex. Here's an example of what babies see in the beginning, just light, dark contrast. They can see color, but they can't understand the idea that there are shapes with lines and contours of starts and stops. They literally just see light, dark contrasts. So we put mobiles above babies' beds to keep them engaged, and this mobile here is a good example because it's got a lot of dark light contrast, really bright saturated colors. This is good because it helps the baby get experience with light dark contrast so they can get better and better at seeing, and eventually they will develop sight like an adult has. So much of the development of seeing has to do with actually brain development. It's not the case that babies' eyes don't work as well. It's actually the case that their brain, in particular their occipital lobe, the area that processes visual information, is not highly developed. So hopefully from Psych 101 you remember that a neuron is a nerve cell that transmits information chemically and electrically and makes all of the things happen in our body that happen. At birth, we have billions of neurons, more neurons than you will ever have the rest of your life, because remember, babies are making prenatally about 250,000 neurons a minute, which is extraordinary. But the problem is that they have very few connections. So you might be thinking, wow, if I had more neurons at birth than ever, why wasn't I a genius at birth? And why am I smarter now, even though I have less neurons? Well, it's because of connections. So the ability to act and interact with the environment is not from sheer number of neurons, but more from the number of connections that you have. So when we're born, we don't have a lot of connections, but we create new connections, and remember the place where neurons touch is called the synapse. So the creation of new connections is synaptogenesis, creation of synapses. And the more that we experience, the more that we see, the more that we hear, the more that we touch, the more that we feel, the more connections we create. So that by 3 months there are many more connections, and by 15 months there are even more connections. But also remember that connections work on a use it or lose it principle. So if you don't exercise connections, they atrophy, just like your muscles. If you don't exercise them, they get weaker. And this process of getting rid of neural connections that aren't used is called synaptic pruning. And as we age, we'll see a lot of synaptic pruning happening because this is how we become specialized at the skills and abilities that we get very good at. Additionally, many of our neurons are covered in something called myelin or myelin sheaths. And myelin is simply a fatty substance that coats the axon of a lot of neurons in an effort to help the electrical message that moves down the axon go faster. So the more myelin we build up, the more quickly our nervous system is able to respond. So babies start to build up myelin, and this process will continue on through a lot of different stages of development. In particular, during infancy, we see a growth of myelin in the language centers of the brain, and that's going to be in preparation for language acquisition, which we'll talk about later. Also, this helps the brain areas function together. The more myelinated the brain areas are, the more cohesively they work together. And from an adult perspective, the more cohesively they work together, the better we function. There are two different ways that we see brain development happen in childhood. The first is what's called experience expectant growth. And experience expectant growth is brain development that you would expect to see in all children everywhere, regardless of experience and culture. So for example, all kids everywhere babble at age 6. That's a reflection of experience expectant growth. But the exact words that they use are different, and that is reflective of experience-dependent growth. This is individualized environments impacting your brain growth. So if you grow up around people who speak English versus around people who speak Mandarin, that's experience-dependent growth because one of those children is going to learn English, the other child is going to learn Mandarin. So there are some basic things that we can expect from all kids, but keep in mind that a large percent of child development, especially brain development, comes from the experiences they're exposed to. So the more varied experiences a child receives, the more rich their experiential context, the more brain development they get, the more connections, and the better off they're going to be. So some things that can help newborns are visual patterns, like we talked about with the mobile, various kinds of sounds, and things that move. All of these can help an infant develop new connections and learn about their environment. From a motor development perspective, babies basically are operating on reflex from the beginning. A reflex is an inborn process that you don't have to learn how to do, you just automatically know. So one reflex that we're born with as humans is the rooting reflex. This is basically when we get touched on the side of our face as infants, we immediately orient to that thing and start sucking on it. This is for feeding. We also have a grasping reflex. If you've ever put your finger into a baby's hand, you know that they clamp down, and they actually clamp down quite hard. This is something that they automatically do. There's arguments that this helped in a time when our species was more nomadic, where a mother would give birth and not be able to lay around for a few days. She'd have to pick up with her group, her nomadic group, and move to find the next source of food, and she'd have to carry that baby, and it'd be helpful if the baby could sort of help themselves a little bit carry on. Another motor development issue is related to sleep, like we talked about earlier. Babies should sleep on their back. There's a movement called the back to sleep movement because it decreases SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. But one thing that's happened then is that babies in the United States who sleep on their back crawl a little bit later. So in order to counter this, they say tummy time to play. So remember, back to sleep, you should sleep on your back when you're an infant, and you should play on your tummy. So they get experience on their back and they get experience on their belly. There are two major kinds of motor skills. Fine motor skills, which involves coordinating small muscle groups. So when you take notes and you're writing, you're actually using a fine motor skill. And in infants, we see a little bit of this. So they start to reach or grasp at around 3 months. And this becomes a very automatic, easy behavior for them by 9 months of age. So that's when you have to baby-proof the house because they can start getting into a lot. Gross motor skills, on the other hand, are the coordination of the big muscles, so the idea of crawling at around 6 months or walking at about a year. The final thing to talk about in physical development is the issue of potty training. The average American child potty trains pretty close to 3, but there are cultures around the world, like we see in the image on the left, where babies walk around in diapers that aren't really diapers. They don't catch anything, they just have holes so that a baby could go to the bathroom. And in the United States, there's something called the diaper-free movement, which we see here in the middle, which is where we take infants, brand new infants in some cases, and start orienting them to the potty. So when a baby becomes potty trained varies largely by culture and how cultures handle the potty training issue and the diaper issue. But really what this is about is differences between, are we talking about eliminating on cue as potty training, or are we talking about holding it as potty training? In the United States, we train children to hold it, being able to sleep throughout the night without wetting the bed, or if you're running through the store and they say, I have to pee, they can hold it until you get to the bathroom. That's what we consider to be potty training. Some of these other cultures, and then even the diaper-free movement, are actually doing something called eliminating on cue, or elimination communication, where they pay attention to their baby's cues, because oftentimes babies will make noises or faces or laugh when they're about to go to the bathroom. So basically you'll, as a parent, watch for those, and then when you can tell that there's going to be a pee or a poop coming, you'll take the baby to the toilet or put them over some kind of a receptacle. Sometimes you can make a noise like pshh to go along to kind of start to train the baby to associate this act of peeing with that sound so that you can start to make that sound and have them pee when you want them to. This really is a lot of different kinds of very interesting techniques that relate back to operant conditioning from intro psychology. So, can a baby be potty trained by 1 year? Yes, if what you're talking about is eliminating on cue. No, if you're talking about holding it. Holding it really physiologically is not that possible until a child is anywhere between 2 to 4.